Hi, I'm Josh McGrath,
I'm Andrew Haas.
and this is the Ardent Pursuit Podcast. Welcome back. Today we're going to discuss what is the purpose of the dating phase. Once you commence your relationship, the journey that you're going to take should look like many other journeys, which is it's leading towards a destination. What is that destination? It's a decision, covenant or not. Now, for us men, we tend to make some very common mistakes, fall into some classic pitfalls along the way. And over the next several weeks, we're going to examine what some of those are to really hopefully help you avoid falling into any of those traps. So Andrew, let's dive in here. We're talking about the purpose behind the dating phase.
Yes.
And I think a question that we should start with is what is the difference between dating to decide versus dating for fun?
The cultural norm now has been dating for fun. And I think the danger there is that we go into it short-sighted or prioritizing what we can get out of it or what we feel in the moment. And we deprioritize or remove altogether anything long-term, anything sacrificial, anything that's selfless.
Yeah, and where you're going is going to inform what you do. And all too often, men enter into a relationship without a vision for something bigger than just, let me be in a relationship.
And I think it's worth pointing out too, I think there's this idea of, there's a spectrum of single and married. Culturally, we, for some reason, put dating down here, like near marriage. You're not married, but you're kind of close.
You're close, yeah.
Whereas single, you're single.
Way far away.
And I would suggest actually dating is more dead center, where dating is not a place you arrive at, as in like, I'm single and I don't want to be single. And dating's close enough. It gets me a partner. I would say that's all misguided.
Yeah.
That this dating phase in the middle is simply just a way to evaluate and to figure out what's next from here.
The dating phase really is an on-ramp ultimately towards marriage. Like anyone who's married didn't suddenly wake up one day and find themselves married and be like, oh my gosh, how did I get here? It was like, no, you actually went on a date, you were in a relationship, and that was an on-ramp to ultimately you deciding that you wanted to end up married. And you can't establish something that is not defined. And so we have encouraged men from the outset to very clearly define what is this relationship, what is the purpose behind it, where are we headed? And by doing so, it's actually going to provide direction and stability, not only for the woman, but for both of you as you're walking out the dating phase.
And I think ideally, I would suggest that guys have a plan before the relationship starts. Culturally, there's this thing, DTR, where we find ourselves in a relationship and now it's like, define the relationship. What are we about? And better late than never if you got to do it then. But what's actually going to be even more beneficial is if a guy can have a working definition of what that relationship could be or should be and go into it with that.
We've mentioned this before, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. And all too often relationships perish. They fizzle out. They don't go anywhere because there isn't a vision for something greater than just simply me being happy, me being fulfilled, me enjoying this experience. And really, ultimately, the modern dating landscape, the dating scene today is very much just practicing for divorce. 40% of all marriages end in divorce. You get second marriages, 63% of those end in divorce. I think the third marriage is like 73%, right? Like, so what we see is that being married more times actually doesn't help you have healthier marriages or be more successful. And in the same way, dating more people doesn't help you be more healthy or more successful in relationships.
Right. The act of dating is not the thing that actually is going to set you up for success. There's nothing you learn through the act of dating. Yeah, you learn to relate to somebody and you learn to sacrifice, hopefully. You learn to communicate. There are things you can learn, but you can learn those with one person. You actually don't learn anything additional by doing it with multiple people. And to your point, the more you do it, ultimately, the harder it's going to make the harder it's going to be for you eventually if you do end up married.
And, for a lot of people right now, they enter the dating phase with kind of the assumption that I'm going to be here for a while. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years that they're going to date. And then they'll figure out kind of what's next. And what we're encouraging men to do is to have purpose, because the purpose actually drives the action.
Yes.
And suddenly, just existing in a state of perpetual dating is no longer satisfying to you, because you're like, I actually want to move to something greater. I actually don't like the status quo of just existing in a dating relationship.
And too often, guys, and probably women, allow themselves to get to a place in a dating relationship where there's enough fulfillment or enough satisfaction where they might be less motivated to actually move things forward. And that's something you got to watch out for. The goal isn't to be at a place where there's comfort or companionship or fulfillment in the dating phase.
Yeah.
You're just there to figure something out. You're not there to stay and enjoy.
Yes. The destination ultimately determines the journey. And an analogy that, we love is this idea of flying. Now, you and I have flown a lot together. We love travel. Great times. And when you're flying from, home to a new destination, oftentimes you're going to have a layover and you're at an airport. And doesn't mean that you shouldn't enjoy that layover. We enjoy our layovers. Go find a great club lounge, get a drink, get some good food.
It's great.
It's awesome. But the goal of that trip is not to set up shop and move into that airport for the next 2, 4, or 8 years. The goal is to get to your destination. And that destination is either the new place you're going, or it's a return home. And that is very much what a dating relationship, the dating phase, should entail. It's not I'm dating now, let me set up shop here and kind of live life like I'm married. But it's actually to say, all right, how do I move as quickly to a destination, either moving forward or moving back?
Right. Be prepared for that season, but don't get comfortable there. Another good analogy that I like is this one of finding a job.
Sure.
You've developed some skills, perhaps a degree, and it's like, okay, time to go find a job. Full-time work. Great. So you go in for an interview. Well, you can imagine someone who just perpetually went in for different job interviews, month over month, year over year. It's like, that's not the point. The point of an interview is ultimately for something way better.
Yes.
And if you just stay in the interview season, everyone would look at that. It's common sense to say, hey, something's not working out here. And so I would say that people who remain in the dating season, the dating phase for a while, yet to be defined what a while is,
Exactly.
but I would say there's actually something off.
Yeah. And it's weird culturally in 2024 to be purposeful and to be wanting to move through the dating phase towards a decision. And I think it's important for men to recognize that it's okay to be weird. And I would argue, why would you want to settle for the status quo? The status quo is just go on perpetual dates, date a ton of people. And what is the result? High divorce rate, people being bitter and angry, people, the chronic singleness syndrome that's happening right now, on social media, people complaining about how there are no good people. They can't find anyone. They're not going on any dates. Social media is terrible and all the dating apps are horrible. And it's so funny because it's this thing where you get all these people culturally saying, no. You need to take your time. You need to slow down. You need to enjoy it. Meanwhile, they're miserable and hate their experience. Misery loves company. So they're telling you that's what you need to do. And I would argue, actually, don't settle for the status quo. Do the weird thing. Have purpose, have vision, move quickly through the dating phase so you're making that decision. And if that decision is headed towards covenant, you are going to, no one who moved through the dating phase quickly and got married looks back and is like, I really wish we had just elongated the dating phase. I really wish we hadn't got married so quickly. I wish we had just kind of taken our time for years and years and years.
Said no married couple ever.
It said no married couple ever.
Yeah.
And so again, you're married 15 years. You probably don't look, how long did you guys date? I don't even know.
2 years.
2 years. Okay. So
Year and a half.
For you, when you look back
Fact
on
check me.
Exactly. When you look back on, the 18 months, the 2 years, however long it was that you guys dated, are you like, man, I wish we had taken longer? Or are you like, man, I wish we had moved quicker?
Yeah, well, and part of the problem there even was I was not mature enough to define what dating was. And there was even a season where it was like, well, are we dating? Are we not? Are we just close friends?
Yeah.
Well, we hang out alone. Does that mean we're dating? There's like all that that nonsense that exists. So, and that's what guys should be aware of. Don't do that.
Yep.
Go into something with some clear guidelines. Know when you're dating.
Yep.
Know when you're not. And, we love to conform.
Yes.
It's just human nature.
Yep.
Not necessarily a bad thing. When you step into an elevator, you just turn around and everybody kind of does the same thing. You're not the weirdo that just walks into an elevator and stays facing the back wall.
As if being in an elevator isn't already awkward enough.
Yes. And with dating and culturally, it's like we have this, unspoken desire to just sort of fit in and do what might be expected.
Sure.
But I would suggest that men need to be ready and willing to embrace something that might be uncomfortable or even perhaps awkward.
Yeah.
And be willing to do something that might be outside the norm.
And to expect that people will likely, whether they're pushing back or they're just trying to encourage you to, slow down, enjoy the season, to recognize that will be probably a lot of the feedback you receive, and to not fall into the trap of being like, oh, I probably should slow down. I should take my time. I should make sure that the dating phase is lasting years, but to have purpose and to move through the dating phase really as quickly as possible, but with wisdom and intentionality.
Yeah, it's really important that a guy is intentional about whose advice he heeds.
Yeah.
If your peers are saying, hey, just slow down and enjoy, or are they saying, hey, go get married next week?
Yeah.
There's probably some wisdom in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's really important, as we've touched on, who you take advice from and what counsel you actually end up implementing.
So the question becomes, what does a man need to know in order to determine what his decision is going to be?
So we've covered some things in prior episodes. There's a few important ones here that we'll touch on. And I think primarily is going to be theology.
Yeah.
If you have a religious background, it is vitally important that this is a primary consideration in someone you pursue.
Yes. If we're born again believers, we're victims of our theology. And so while you don't need to pursue somebody who maybe agrees on all of the theology that you hold, you have to agree on primary theology. In the Christian worldview, that is faith through Christ alone. You have to agree on that. It's helpful to agree on the secondary and tertiary doctrine. Yep. Absolutely. That you'll have less arguments probably around the dinner table as a result. It'll be easier to pick the type of church you attend, but you have to agree on primary doctrine together. And I think about the fact that faith, for anyone who comes from a religious background, their faith should be the most central part of their life and should be the most important part of their life.
Well, it absolutely should be the most important. And I think it's interesting to consider if someone is willing to take their religion and set it aside or have it become a smaller part of their life in pursuit of a woman, if that's going to make them more interesting to a woman.
Yeah.
Well, what does that say? Well, maybe if I remove religion altogether, I'll be even more interesting.
Yep.
If you're willing to set it aside, then I would actually question the importance of it to begin with. And if your faith is not the most important thing, then what is it doing?
Yes. Yeah, if a man is willing to compromise on his theological convictions, that is not a man that should be in a relationship. That's not a man who can lead, because he's willing to just give up the most important part of his life to appease somebody else, to make somebody else happy. And that it's extremely alarming and concerning. I think about the fact that, when it comes to, part of the theological framework that you're going to have to work through for those people who come from a background of faith is, okay, what is the type of church we're going to attend? And, again, from the Protestant worldview, there's a lot of denominations. There's a lot of different types of churches you could go to. I was born and raised in a charismatic evangelical church. So if I was pursuing a woman who only had grown up and known a more traditional church environment, it would be very challenging for me to say, well, I'm just going to give up the non-denominational charismatic church experience I've had to attend church with you. That would be extremely difficult for me. And vice versa, it'd probably be very difficult for her to say, well, I'm just going to give up everything I've known regarding my church experience to step into a charismatic evangelical environment. And so while those, church backgrounds aren't necessarily going to be a deal breaker in a relationship, discussing those and working through that is very important, because that can be a very contentious thing, particularly for people of faith, because practicing my faith on a Sunday morning is extremely important to me. My life revolves around my faith. And so if her faith experience is lived out in a very different environment than what I'm used to, there's going to be a tension there.
It would be foolish for a guy to say, she's amazing, we can work it out, and she's awesome, and we'll figure it out. Not a big deal.
Yeah.
No, it's a big deal, and you need to talk about and actually figure these things out sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Because long term, it just does not play in your favor to have differing beliefs as a primary consideration.
It blows my mind the number of people who will end up pursuing a relationship and or marrying someone who they're like, it will just work out. If we just date long enough or once we're married, it will work out. He'll end up, coming to church, or he'll end up, his life being transformed by Jesus, or he'll end up, in some cases, being saved. And it's like, never bet on a future unknown in an environment of covenant and family. Absolutely not. And for any Christian woman, she should not be in a relationship or pursuing any man who Jesus is not the most important person in his life. For any Christian man, he should not be pursuing any type of woman who Jesus is not the most important person in her life.
And it's well understood that our backgrounds and the culture we're in, that we were raised in, really affect and influence who we are.
Sure.
And so as a guy, you're going to want to understand and know where she comes from, what has influenced her, culturally, but also theologically. Because balancing that, her coming on board with you, or vice versa, blending two religious backgrounds could be a lot trickier than you think. And it's just something to go into with wisdom and discussion and, conversation. You figure it out. But the point is, don't ignore it. Don't just think it will work out. This is a big deal. Put in the time to make it work.
Another thing that, very different from theology that actually has become very important are politics.
Yes. Politics play an increasingly bigger role in people's outlook, who they might consider. And our advice would be to get on the same page to the extent that you can. There's probably a time in the past where people with differing political backgrounds might be in a relationship just fine.
Sure, like 30 or 40 years ago, that was much easier.
Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Now, I would be very hesitant to pursue someone that had notably different political views than I did.
Yes, the goal is not to have the same identical political views.
Yes.
Might be helpful, but that's not the goal.
Yeah.
However, politics is a result of our values. So while you don't have to be on the same page politically, you have to be on the same page when it comes to your values. And as a result of having the same values, you will likely be very similar in your political beliefs, even if they're not identical. And it's important to recognize the role that politics does play in our culture today, because really in the last, maybe 10 years, we've actually seen political positions, people, saying they're going to vote one way or the other, divide marriages, divide families, divide friends, divide churches, divide work environments. It's really created a very divisive culture in America. And so you don't want to be ignorant to the fact that there's going to be some type of tension in our relationship if we have divergent political beliefs.
And not that you could not end up marrying someone with notably different political views than you.
Sure, it could happen.
Could happen.
May not be wise.
May not be wise, and it likely takes a really high level of emotional intelligence. And so just be real with yourself.
Yep.
Do I have what it takes to partner with somebody who may think and believe differently? And just honestly answer that question.
Another important aspect of, the evaluating process that men need to go through is getting to know her family, her friends, and her community. You want to know where she comes from. Unless you've had the privilege of growing up with her in the same, town, you will likely have to do some work to get to know her family. Why? Because the goal isn't just, do we get along and are we happy in our own separate corner of the world? We've talked about this before. When you marry each other, when you're moving towards covenant, you're bringing in two families as part of that union. And so getting to know where she comes from and her getting to know where you come from is vitally important to the success of that union.
And you could think, oh, what's the big deal? Like, I hang out with her, I get to know who she is, and I know who she is. And I would suggest that you actually don't know who somebody is simply by what they communicate to you.
Sure.
That certainly helps. But there's actually a lot about a person that they might not even be able to communicate or know to communicate. And you can learn and should learn who somebody is through their friends, through their family, through their community.
Yeah.
By getting to know all of those things, you'll learn more about who the person is. And that's only going to help you better figure out, is there a future here?
Another thing that I think is important are interests. While interests aren't, the main thing that you're going to evaluate, it's important to learn about each other's interests as part of the evaluation process. And I think sometimes culturally what we do is we think, by living life in a dating relationship, as long as, the years come and go, that's where I'm going to learn all about their interests by, just living life and doing things and experiences. And that's where I get to know about the likes or dislikes. And I'm like, actually, there's a much more efficient route. What you can do is you can literally go through like your top interests and have a conversation about them. You, like in a couple hours sitting in a coffee shop, you can get to know a lot about someone's interests, likes and dislikes.
Yeah.
You don't need to live life for the next 2 years to figure out what do they like and what they don't like.
And the interesting thing with interests is that we have this habit or this default assumption that if we have the same interests,
We're compatible.
then we're compatible.
Oh my gosh, not at all.
And that's like, that can be prioritized. That's elevated to a point where if we have the same interests, then it's going to work out.
Sure.
And maybe here nor there, but I would suggest that actually having different interests could play into
Absolutely.
that could be a success for you. There was a point where I knew nothing about rock climbing, and a friend was like, "Hey, will you come rock climb with me? I need a partner to work the ropes."
Yep.
I said sure, went along with it, and it's one of my favorite things to this day. And likewise, I've introduced friends to different board games, and they're like, "Wow, this is so much fun." And so the aligning of interests, that sort of thing kind of works itself out.
Yeah.
Now, something to be intentional about.
Yes.
Don't misplace its priority, and also don't ignore it.
Yeah, I think about like there are certain types of interests that you're going to want to know up front whether you're compatible. I think about, travel. I've said it before. We love traveling. You and I do a lot of traveling. Our friends group does a lot of traveling. I love flying. I love going places. And so if I was pursuing a woman who was like, I hate travel, I hate flying, I hate airports, I hate new experiences, I only want to stay home, that would be extremely difficult for me. Like that's like an about face in my life. And even a lot of the things I feel God's calling me to do. And so like, I would have to evaluate that really heavily. Again, it may not be a deal breaker,
Right.
but it's gonna be a part of my evaluation process. Whereas, let me share something that's not significant. She doesn't like sushi, but I love sushi. I'm like, let's go try sushi everywhere. That's an interest that I have is good sushi. If she doesn't like good sushi or sushi at all, I'm not like, oh my gosh, this isn't gonna work out. I don't need to figure out if she likes sushi. That's not on my list of do we have the same interests, same likes, same dislikes.
And her liking sushi doesn't.
It bears no consequence in my life. And so part of, I think the wisdom that you're offering here is saying like, look, you've got to understand, you don't want to give too much weight to certain interests, likes or dislikes that don't bear any significance on a relationship, but there are certain interests that like you do want to evaluate. And part of the way you can evaluate that is even by going to your authority and accountability and asking, hey, here's something I realize we're not aligned on when it comes to interests. Does this matter? Should this be something that I weigh heavily, or is this just something that I can just kind of throw out?
And as you mentioned in your travel example, that would be something for you to get on board with, recognizing, say she didn't like to travel. Okay, if I pursue her, it will likely mean I don't travel as much or at all. And that's just, that's something you've got to reckon with. Yes. Okay, am I okay pursuing her and possibly not traveling or as much as I want to? And so, there's no right or wrong answer. It's simply having the self-awareness to answer these things honestly.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of travel, another area that you're going to have to evaluate depending upon where each of you come from is geographically. Mm-hmm. So imagine that you grew up on the East Coast, your family's there, your job's there, your life is there. And she grew up on the West Coast, her family's there, her job's there, her life is there. And you meet somehow, you end up pursuing one another, and now you want to move towards marriage. Well, you're going to have to figure out where you're going to end up living. Are you going to leave everything you've known to live on the West Coast? Is she going to leave everything she's known to live on the East Coast? Are you going to just pick the middle of the country and just neither of you be happy? Like, what is the plan there? And that's something you have to evaluate, because if both of you come from a background where you're like, no, I'm digging in my feet and I'm not leaving, that's going to be really hard. I am a 4 seasons guy. I need a white Christmas. So I'm not going to pursue someone who doesn't enjoy a white Christmas and who doesn't live or come from a place where there's a white Christmas. Because that's like, I don't want to visit your parents and it be sunny and hot. That's a terrible Christmas. So I'm sorry, ladies out on the West Coast, down south. I've relegated myself to the Northeast or Europe. Those are my options. Where is there snow at Christmas? That's who I can be interested in. And then so like something like that, like knowing that is going to be important as part of your evaluation process.
Yeah, and notably different geographies, I think, are important to just seriously consider, because, much like the honeymoon phase.
Which I don't know anything about.
Not yet. Someday. Or, even in the dating phase, there's like this fun initial excitement, but we all know that things eventually wear off, and it circles back around, but there's like this ebb and flow. Same thing with living somewhere. If you move to a significantly different place than what you know, there's a fun, and it's new and it's exciting, but it will wear off. And the question is, it'll wear off for her, it'll wear off for you. And so those are real things that you just have to think through.
Yes.
Am I okay moving to a new place that I no longer find interesting or fun, and the new has worn off? Can I still live life here with her? And she'll have to do the same thing.
Yeah. And just because we're in 2024, we're going to share a final bit of advice when it comes to evaluating the decision process, which is just make sure that she was born a woman.
Yes.
Born female, born a girl, born, I don't know how else to say it. Like whatever descriptors I use, culture's like, that's not what that means. So that's just good. If you're visiting her family and you see a picture of a boy on a mantle and you realize that her parents have no boys,
maybe ask a few questions.
Also, back to our previous episode about physical boundaries, you'll be very thankful for those physical boundaries at that moment.
Yes. And another important thing that we want to touch on here is, how long should you date?
That is probably the question that a lot of people want to know.
Yes.
And they're going to want to have a definitive time of knowing this is how long I should date before I'm making this decision.
Yes. And while there's no specific answer to that.
There isn't, and we're not going to give one.
Nope, we're not going to give one. But we will say, don't date any longer than you have to, or don't date any longer than you should. And you need to be able to answer that question.
Yep.
How long should I date? Or I'm not going to date any longer than necessary.
And one of the best ways to answer that question is by inviting authority and accountability to that process, because you, in isolation alone, will not do a good job at answering that question.
Yes. Yeah, you're going to be subjective. You're going to have your own thoughts and opinions. And, we like to make these checklists of, okay, after A, B, C, D, E, then I can move on.
Yep.
We're really bad at coming up with our own checklists. And so with the help of others, that's how we navigate that well. But on our own, we're going to be really poor at that.
I also think that there may be a group of men out there who are dating, who want to move towards marriage, who are like, yes, I love what you're saying. I just can't move towards marriage yet because of the season I'm in. Maybe they're in college and they want to graduate first, or because they just graduated college and they're living with their parents as they get on their feet financially, or maybe a whole another set of reasons. And what I would say is that it is unloving and unkind to put a woman on layaway for when you are finally ready to commit to her. That is just you being selfish. And if you're not man enough to be able to make a decision, either to say, we're not going to be in a relationship now because I can't move towards marriage, or I am going to move to marriage. If you're not man enough to be able to make a decision, you're not man enough to be in a relationship at all.
And you really got to have the mental awareness and the community, again, to have, what are valid things that I should wait for? Do I wait to graduate? Do I not? These are all subjective things, right? Do I wait to buy a home? Do I wait to have a full-time job?
Sure.
They're all subjective. There's no right or wrong answer to any of them. And so to selectively pick, I must have these things, or no, these things aren't important. I think either way, those are things you really have to evaluate with a mentor or accountability.
Yeah, very true. So as we conclude here, for those of you who are in a relationship and have been so for more than a year, if you haven't yet evaluated whether or not you're able to move closer to a decision, you need to this week sit down and begin to figure out what that process looks like. Go to your authority and accountability and ask them to speak into this process so that you're not letting any more time go by, so that you're moving closer to a decision. Again, don't set up shop in the airport. That's not where you're supposed to reside. You want to get to your destination. And then for those of you who are not in a relationship but are wanting to be and want to be married one day, start thinking through what are those things that I'm going to need to evaluate in order to be able to make a decision. And like Andrew said, don't do it in isolation. If you're doing it alone, your checklist and the things that you're going to prioritize may not be good. So go to your authority, go to your accountability, sit down with them, invite them into that process so that whatever you're coming up with, once you're in a relationship, you can kind of begin to walk through that evaluation process. Well, as always, we love having you here on the Art of Pursuit podcast, and we look forward to having you here next time.